Welcome to the Ricci Flow Nutrition Podcast. My name is Cameron Borg. In this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Rosalba Courtney. Rosalba is an osteopath, researcher, author, and teacher. She has a PhD on the topic of dysfunctional breathing and breathing therapy and has published widely in the scientific literature and contributed to various textbook chapters. Rosalba is passionate about both the art and science of breathing. She believes that breathing combined with movement, mind-body techniques and other health practices has enormous potential as a tool to heal the mind and body. She is actively involved in ongoing research on broad topics related to breathing and health. Rosalba has developed a system called Integrative Breathing Therapy based on the models and tools she developed during her PhD and subsequent research. She has trained health professionals from many disciplines including physiotherapy, psychology, speech and language pathology, osteopathy, and integrative medicine in the theory and applications of breathing therapy for their field. She is currently developing her first online certification course in the Foundations of Integrative Breathing Therapy for health professionals. Rosalba really has done the foundational work that has contributed greatly to the understanding of breathing's role in health and wellness. Her PhD work and subsequent publications have inspired those who are now synonymous with breathing practices. She identified first that breathing must be thought of in terms of biochemistry, biomechanics, and psychophysiology. This concept is now widely used but not always credited to her. Rosalba is someone whom I greatly admire, and I'm very grateful she has done so much hard work exploring this issue, particularly as breathing disorders are becoming more prevalent yet remain largely unrecognized. So with all that being said, I hope you enjoy the episode. So thank you for speaking with me today, Rosalba. I've really been looking forward to this. You were involved in the book that I mentioned to you before. That I think is really one of the primary works that I think people should look into. So
yes,
I was wondering how you got into looking at breathing from an osteopathic point of view.
I didn't necessarily get into it from an osteopathic point of view.
Right.
So my background is that I've been in practice for about 45 years as an osteopath, naturopath, acupuncturist, herbalist, and I trained back in the 1970s and was just interested in healing and how the body heals and what happens when, people aren't healing. And that when I had patients who I couldn't help, I would just keep looking.
Right.
And so I had a few patients who had unusual breathing disorders that no one seemed to be able to help terribly well. I had one case of a guy who he thought he inhaled a bug, and he had a lot of breathing distress. And it turned out that his girlfriend had left him, and he'd lost his job, and he'd had a whole lot of stress and trauma. And so he was having difficulty breathing and was attributing it to a bug, but it was really to do with, the way his brain and nervous system was throwing his breathing control system out of whack. Because breathing's very sensitive to, psychological and emotional influences, because breathing's always trying to make us, adapt to the internal and external changes in our environment. So it's kind of a sensitive system to all kinds of things. And then I had a few other patients with, severe asthma and different bits and pieces. And I took some time out of my clinic to be with my second child. And so that would have been 30 years ago, because that child is now 30. And in those days, I stumbled across the Buteyko method. And so I ended up, training the Buteyko method, went to Russia, met Buteyko, became chairperson of the association, and wrote the first training courses around the world. And this is in about 1994. And but the more I looked into it, the more I realized that Buteyko had, lots of limitations. It was a little bit cultish and a bit of a narrow view, really, of what breathing was.
Yeah.
And so I just had lots of questions. So even though I was working with patients and training practitioners and really interested and into it, I realized that actually there was more to this than I'd first understood. So I decided to stop teaching for a while, and I just went back and I did a PhD. So I did a PhD, which took me 8 years. It wasn't meant to take that long, but that's how long it took. And I just, asked some of the questions, and I designed research to answer those questions. So I repeated some of Buteko's research, looking at, the correlation between, breath holding time and carbon dioxide. And what I got out of that was a whole model, of dysfunctional breathing. So I finished my PhD in 2012, and I actually published 7 research papers in that time.
Yeah.
And, came up with a model of dysfunctional breathing, which was this multi-dimensional model, which a few people have sort of used sometimes without acknowledging me, but, that model was sort of based on research. So what I did was I gave people a whole bunch of measures that were being used for dysfunctional breathing, and then I looked to see how those measures correlated. And what I found was that the measures didn't necessarily correlate across dimensions, but they correlated within dimensions. So the 3 key dimensions were biochemical, to do with carbon dioxide, hyperventilation, CO2, oxygen even. And then the other dimension was biomechanical, to do with the muscles of breathing and the feedback from the muscles of breathing to the breathing control system.
Right.
And then there was a third dimension, which was the psychophysiological. So people could have breathing disorders, breathing symptoms, strange breathing patterns, and their carbon dioxide be normal, right?
Yeah. So
Buteko's whole model was that hyperventilation is the cause of all diseases, and 90% of people are hyperventilating,
right.
and so there was the whole sort of model there, and so what I wanted to do was to sort of find out the truth of all that, like what's actually going on here. And so out of that, I just developed a whole kind of way of looking at breathing, which included that 3-dimensional model. Yep. Also a sort of a definition of what is functional and dysfunctional breathing.
Yep.
So, it used to be that people only talked about hyperventilation. And then in about the late 90s, they realised that people who had symptoms of hyperventilation weren't necessarily hyperventilating. They didn't have low CO2. So then in the late 90s, this, term called dysfunctional breathing started to be used. So, my PhD, a big question that I asked during that PhD was, okay, if there's something called dysfunctional breathing, then what is functional breathing? And what I came up with was dysfunctional breathing is not just hyperventilation, but dysfunctional breathing, to me, I went, okay, so dysfunctional breathing, it's breathing that doesn't fulfill its functions. So what are the functions of breathing? And it's there are primary functions, which have to do with maintenance of blood gases and the respiratory pump, the movement of the rib cage and the muscles of breathing. And then there's they're the primary functions of breathing, but then there are secondary functions of breathing to do with, the way we use breathing for self-regulation, or secondary functions of breathing would be to do with, voice production and, sound. And then there's also breathing is a rhythm. It's an oscillating rhythm that is influencing other rhythms within the body. So it's it's a driver of oscillations, and which are really important for homeostasis, which is the body's ability to maintain stability in the face of change, and so on. So it's I went, okay, so dysfunctional breathing is breathing that doesn't do that. So then how do you measure that? So clinically, what are the practical aspects of that? So how do you measure someone with dysfunctional breathing? And so what I did in my PhD was I developed tools and measures. So I developed, a protocol for measuring dysfunctional breathing that looked at the three dimensions, the biochemical, the biomechanical, the psychophysiological, based on what was in the research literature, in the whole body of literature about breathing, over the years. And ideas had really changed. So it's very interesting to watch how ideas change over time. And so anyway, the model that I came up with was just sort of gave me sort of a way to practically and pragmatically measure people's breathing, and then adjust treatment, to their individual needs and their individual type of dysfunction, and then to re-measure at the end to see, have I made a difference? What else does this person need? And then to try and give appropriate type breathing, therapies or other things that would help to improve that aspect of breathing. So I don't know, that's a big story, but that's sort of it in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, you ticked off a few of the other things that I was going to ask you straight away,
Okay.
but I guess I just want to get, a 10,000-foot view on what functional breathing looks like. What does an optimal breathing pattern
It's
look
variable for a start.
Right.
Okay? It's variable. It's not a static thing that's just breathing parameters. Okay? So it's not just breathing at a particular speed or depth or always with your belly and your lower rib cage. So functional breathing is just breathing that helps to maintain your health.
Yep.
So it would be breathing that is appropriate for you given what's going on with you. So functional breathing in someone who has a respiratory disease or a cardiovascular disease would look different to functional breathing in someone who's healthy.
Yep.
Okay? So you would expect a person in normal health to have normal breathing parameters. But then people who are very anxious or depressed or this or that, their breathing will reflect what their body is telling them needs to happen, for homeostasis to occur. And very often what I see, because in the breathing therapy world, there are a lot of people who, some of the leaders in the field don't even have a medical degree, have no training. So they kind of work off ideas or pushing a particular therapy. And I think this does the whole field a disservice because it's kind of nuanced, and what I see is that a lot of times people who are anxious and whose breathing has become difficult, they might know that they can sort of slow their breathing and feel a little bit better.
Yep.
And so what they start to do is to over-control their breathing, all the time, because they have this idea that there's this sort of, a perfect way to breathe, So having come from the Buteyko world, the whole idea is that everyone should be breathing less.
Yep.
Okay? And actually some of the most powerful breathing techniques involve breathing strongly in a vigorous way, because breathing heals in lots of interesting ways, not just through correcting CO2 or calming the nervous system. Sometimes, you're seeing out there in popular popular breathing techniques, you'll see such a diversity of approaches, and they're all right and they're all wrong.
Yeah.
Because to really use breathing as a healing tool, in people who are sicker, you need to understand it deeply.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can't just throw the same technique at everyone and expect it to work.
Or have rigid ideas about what perfect breathing is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's a great point. That's something I hadn't really considered all that much. The idea that there are going to be exercises, there are going to be patterns that are going to help different people at different stages.
Yeah.
And that's a really important thing to understand, that really what we want our breathing to be is dynamic and able to adapt to our
Yeah.
what we're doing in our life.
Flexible. Anything that's functional is flexible.
Yeah.
That would be kind of a key point, really. And I mean, most people can do with slowing their breathing down.
Yeah.
You know, and most people can do with relaxing their breathing muscles, And there are a lot of people who hyperventilate out there, and there are a lot of people who are just putting way too much effort into breathing. But it can't be, breathing isn't something that stands outside everything else. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's part of everything else that's going on with a person. And so I think for practitioners who are working with breathing, it's really important that they, know a person's history, understand their medical situation, understand what's gone on with them, and work with breathing in a kind of a, more individualised way, and certainly not a rigid and fanatical way.
So what are the things that sort of the foundational things that we would consider to be aspects of good breathing, the things that apply to everyone, so to speak?
Yeah, I think for most people, for most people, you need to move more.
Mm-hmm.
You need to relax more. So you want to be able to be having a dynamic life with activity and rest.
Yep.
And then breathing that reflects that. And so, for example, you hear a lot about nasal breathing. You should always be nasal breathing. And yes, it's nasal breathing fulfilled so many functions. It's really great. The nose is the gateway to the whole breathing system. It interacts with the brain. It helps to, regulate, the chemistry of breathing to some extent.
Yep.
But you don't want to even get fanatical about nasal breathing, to tell you the truth. Because, for example, I've had people come to me who have been to see a breathing therapist, and they've been told you should always nasal breathe. And they get and they actually haven't got enough space to breathe, or they have some issue there. And they get really sort of fanatical, and it makes them quite anxious. And sometimes what I've got to do is actually pull that back a little bit and go, okay, go and deal with the causes of your nasal obstruction.
Right.
And then if you're still mouth breathing, then let's work with the nasal functions. If the muscles of breathing aren't working well, like if the nasal muscles, aren't opening the nose, what's that all about? So that's related to the serotonergic system and things like that. So, I do a lot of work in nasal rehabilitation and helping people, learn to nasal breathe.
Yep.
But sometimes I'm also just trying to get people off the oversimplified ideas. And even with exercise, for example, if you nasal breathe during exercise, it will stop your airways drying and cooling. Some people find that their performance increases. But it also puts a bigger strain on the heart. And it also means that you're not performing at you don't get as even necessarily ventilation throughout the lungs.
Right.
And at the higher levels of exercise, it's not a bad idea to sometimes mouth breathe, given certain circumstances.
Yep.
So if you get someone who's exercising, I just saw a paper today, came out of Japan, people who are exercising in high temperatures will hyperventilate when they're exercising. If they breathe through their nose, it actually has a protective effect on that.
Right.
But so, there are sort of good functions, but I just think that things become kind of trends, and sometimes people lose the balance. And I guess that's why I'm sort of overstating maybe, nasal breathing is great. But there are times when it's actually more appropriate and functional to breathe through your mouth. I've actually put things on social media where people have been talking about, the importance of nasal breathing in exercise. And I've just made a comment, sometimes it's actually not the best thing. Like sometimes there are situations where you take a few mouth breaths or you breathe through the mouth at high levels of exercise and it appears to be actually, to have some advantages. And they've actually completely removed my post. You're not even allowed to say it.
Yeah, right.
That there's, and I just think that we should be open to nuance and we should be open to always challenging our ideas and exploring, what we believe to be truth. And, that's, I guess I came to science later in my life, because I was 50 when I started my PhD. And then I really learned what scientific process is and this sort of keeping an open and a curious mind and always being willing to first of all putting, the truth first, the questions first.
Yeah, and science is very hard.
It's hard.
And you have to be willing to put your ideas on the line to move forward. And I think sometimes, particularly when there's money on the line for people, they get lost in their own ideas and it becomes more of you play a defensive game rather than a game of discovery.
It's just the way we are as humans, isn't it? Do this whole idea of confirmation bias, and we protect our ideas and what we believe becomes part of our identity. And it's not necessarily the bad people who are like that. It's just the way humans are. It's just how we operate. Yeah. And it's but what science does is it just minimizes confirmation bias. It would never get rid of it. But, yeah.
So from your perspective, what are some telltale signs that someone might be struggling with their breathing? When you're looking at someone and talking to them.
Usually they have unexplained breathing discomfort and they can't perform different functions, like they can't use their breath to calm themselves.
Right.
They feel uncomfortable with their breathing and they're breathless out of proportion to their fitness and out of proportion to whatever pathology is going on. And their breathing is not able to shift from an active configuration to a relaxed configuration. So meaning that when they're active, they're not breathing sufficiently for an active person, but when they're at rest, they're not able to breathe like a relaxed person. So they've lost that sort of, functionality and variability and appropriateness of their breathing.
Yeah.
So that would be one thing. Also, when I measure people, I take symptoms and I use some validated symptom scales, included ones that I've developed myself, the Self-Evaluation of Breathing Questionnaire and the Nijmegen Questionnaire, which has been around for 40 years.
Yep.
Then I will measure people's oxygen, carbon dioxide, breathing rate and heart rate at rest. And then I take an average over about 5 minutes.
Right.
And if I'm seeing that the breathing is very unstable, that would be a sign. And also if I'm seeing low levels of carbon dioxide, or if the oxygen's low, or if I'm seeing that respiratory rate is very high and they're sitting there at rest, that would be a sign. And then what I do is I check the breathing under certain challenges. So things like standing, I get them to do a sit-to-stand test. I would get them to even do a hyperventilation test where they hyperventilate on purpose, and then I look at how they recover. So the whole idea being that functional breathing is appropriate and it adapts to stress in an appropriate way and then it recovers appropriately. So then I do those challenge tests. Then I look at breathing pattern. I look at how they're breathing at rest, and then I look at how their breathing changes under certain postural challenges.
Right.
Okay? So I see, what do they do when they slump? What do they do when they're upright? What happens to their breathing when they breathe deeply? What happens to their breathing when I ask them to breathe a particular way? And if they can't, if their breathing isn't appropriate, adaptive and responsive, I pick it up like that in the breathing pattern test.
Yep.
And then I'll look at things like breath holding time.
Right.
And I'll look at how their breathing responds to breath holding time. And, and then I also look at their airway. So I look at the nose. I look at how the nose performs at rest and under some challenges. And then I also look at their upper airway and their tongue. So that would be the sort of thing, So it's kind of like I'm a health professional. That's what I've done my whole life. So I'm more focused on sort of helping people who need to work with breathing as a tool for healing where, the situation's a bit more challenging, sort of really, But I also love using breathing. Oh, the other thing I do is I measure the strength of the diaphragm.
Yes, right.
So I look at the strength of the diaphragm and I look to see what pressures a person can generate during inspiration and expiration.
Yeah.
And whether that's appropriate for their, age and physical size and gender and situation.
Yeah.
So, and then I plan what we're going to do about that. Mm-hmm. Wherever I found something that's not quite right, I try and optimize the breathing system, whether that's working through, improving the nose, improving the upper airway, the tongue, working with the diaphragm strength, whether it means teaching them to relax their breathing and their breathing muscles, or whether it means teaching them to have stronger breathing, to breathe more, or to really work with just getting the rhythms and the patterns of breathing more appropriate with what they're trying to, heal from, recover from. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about quite a simple measure that I use quite regularly called the control pause.
Yes.
It's very simple to do, so it's something that I like to utilize.
I know it extremely well.
So how effective is that as for someone with no equipment who might just want to, find out a little bit more about where they're at? How useful is that to sort of pick up on where people are at with their breathing?
Yeah, sure. That's a really, good question because the control pauses comes from the Buteyko method. So the control pause, Buteyko developed this way of assessing people's breathing, looking at how long they could hold their breath after a normal exhale until they felt the first urge to breathe. So that's the Buteyko control pause. Yeah. It's holding your breath at what's called functional residual capacity. So you breathe in, breathe out, and then you hold your breath. And Buteyko's idea, and actually he did research and he found a correlation for himself between the length of time that you could hold your breath and what the level of carbon dioxide was. So he said it's a measure of hyperventilation. And to some extent that's true. People who are really bad hyperventilators, they often have no tolerance for the rise of CO2 because their whole chemistry of breathing has gone out of whack. And so we know that people who are bad hyperventilators often have these really short breath holding time. But it's not... One of my first bits of research during my PhD was actually to look at the control pause.
Right.
And to see what does the control pause correlate with. So I had 85 people and I measured their control pause, but I did it in a few different ways. So I looked at breath holding time until the first desire to breathe.
Yep.
Then I looked at breath holding time until the first involuntary movement from the muscles of breathing. And then I looked at maximal breath holding time.
Yep.
And then I looked for correlations between resting carbon dioxide levels, between breathing pattern, and between breathing symptoms. And what I found was that the strongest correlation was not with CO2, not with breathing symptoms, but with breathing pattern, with the state of the breathing muscles.
Right. With
the diaphragm. With how the diaphragm is functioning. And so I went, oh, wow, okay, that's interesting. So then, I published this, in journals. And then I had to go as I'm writing it up, I'm going, wow, how do I, because when you write a paper, you do your introduction, you say, why did you ask this question, and da-da-da-da, and then you describe your methods, and then you give your results, and then you've got to do a discussion. You've got to say, what's the meaning of this? So when you do your discussion, you've always got to put it in the context of all the other literature. And what I found was that they're actually in the physiological literature about breath holding time, they go, yeah, the strongest determinant of breath holding time is actually feedback from the diaphragm to the brain.
Yeah, right. That's a bit counterintuitive. I would have thought that CO2 would have been the thing that would have correlated with most.
Yeah, it makes sense that it would, because you would think, oh, when the person reaches their threshold, the chemoreceptor sort of threshold, that they would then let go of the breath. But it was really interesting, because this is why it's so important to measure, and to test your assumptions. Because I'd been working 10 years, with the control pause, and sort of using that as a determinant of, whether people were hyperventilating and how they improved from treatment.
Yeah.
And so I had to go, oh, that's really interesting. And then you find, oh my God, there's this really interesting old research that was done with medical students, back in the, whatever it was, 20s or 30s or something. And they actually paralyzed them with curare, the drug curare, Amazon hunting poison.
Yeah.
They put it on the tip of the arrow and then shoot the animal. The animal is paralyzed, can't breathe, can't run away. So they actually gave curare to these medical students, and they artificially ventilated them, and then they turned the ventilators off, and they watched their oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. So they watched the carbon dioxide levels rise and the oxygen drop. And then they, when things were looking dangerous, they turned the ventilators back on again. And then they asked them, at what point did you feel the urge to breathe? And they said, we never did.
Interesting.
So with no feedback from respiratory muscles.
Right.
It's like it doesn't quite, happen. So it's kind of complex. So look, when people's breathing isn't good, and ventilatory drive is too high, the drive to breathe is like too switched on, like you would think of in a hyperventilator, then you might find, then when ventilatory drive is high, then people have got no tolerance for not breathing. But ventilatory drive is high for lots of different reasons. It can have to do with pathology. It can have to do with the state of the nervous system. It can be brainstem stuff. It can be, it can be the chemoreflex response, the CO2 thing. But it's certainly not telling you about the blood oxygen level.
Right.
Okay, it's certainly not telling you clearly and in a definite manner what the CO2 is. Although, you can in a general way, for the general public, you could sort of say, well, yeah, if your breath holding time is short and you work with training the breathing, it gets longer.
Yeah.
And as you see things improve and function better, usually that breath holding time starts to go up. It's like you've got better homeostasis. And so there's more tolerance for things shifting, out of a slightly different range, and the body can cope with different signals without needing to immediately freak out and react, So that would be
Yeah, that's
story.
fascinating, because I would have thought that the reflex was purely from a chemoreceptor point of view, but it seems like a delicate dance between the physical feedback and the chemical feedback.
We get back to these three dimensions: biochemical, biomechanical, psychophysiological.
All right, well, let's talk about the diaphragm. It's something that's very interesting to me, because it seems to play a diverse array of roles in the body, not just as the primary breathing muscle, but also for stabilization of the lower back. And something that I found very interesting in the book was that people with chronic lower back pain had notable changes in how their diaphragm sat, because it wasn't stabilizing their lower back. And it also seems to play a role, breathing with the diaphragm, or engaging the diaphragm with breathing, in regulating the autonomic balance, so the balance between sort of stress and relaxation,
Yeah.
parasympathetic and sympathetic. So broadly speaking, what are the primary roles of the diaphragm in from all those three points of view?
Yeah. Yeah, well, the diaphragm, this like massive muscle. For a start, it's two muscles.
Right.
Okay. Embryologically, part of it develops with the gastrointestinal system,
Right.
and another part evolves with the respiratory, evolves, no, it's not evolve, develops, okay, with the respiratory system. So you've got the middle part of the diaphragm that actually is fed by the vagus, which is the nerve the parasympathetic nerve to all the different organs of the body. So a function of the diaphragm is actually to, control reflux.
Yep.
And it functions to close that it's one of the sphincters for preventing reflux. And then it's proprioceptive, so it's got a lot of proprioceptive fibers, so it can evaluate, the body in space, and the diaphragm, clearly it's a respiratory muscle, so it increases the intrathoracic volume. It drops the pressure so that air can come in. So it does that. So, but it's also a postural muscle that responds to pretty much whatever you do. If you raise your arm, your diaphragm will fire. If you go up on your toes, it will fire. If you change, body position, the diaphragm responds because it's actually controlling the centre of gravity in a way, I suppose you could say, So it's an important regulator of intra-abdominal pressure, which plays a key role in core stability. So, yeah, it does all of that. And when people are breathing, predominantly with what's called the active configuration of breathing, which is with the upper chest and in a vertical manner, and they're doing that even when they're at rest. Often the rest of other postural muscles will be responding to that way of breathing, and they actually don't generate such good intra-abdominal pressure to keep their core stability. And the diaphragm's also working together with the pelvic floor, the muscles at the front and the back of the body, to regulate that intra-abdominal pressure. So that's kind of really important. The other thing too is that the diaphragm, it can generate a lot of force. So it's important for generating the force that regulates the homeostasis in the cardiovascular system. So it helps to regulate cardiac vagal control of the heart and blood pressure regulation in the body, and also drives and regulates probably fluid pressures in many places in the body, including cerebrospinal fluid.
Right.
Perhaps, but certainly it's important for moving fluids as well as air, and also making the core stability.
Yep. I always found it very interesting to think that, growing up, I probably never used to breathe with my diaphragm. I grew up with asthma and probably mouth breathing a lot. And it's taken me a long time to realize that, probably my diaphragm engagement was probably not very good. And reading in the book, there were poses like the beach pose, where you lie back with your hands behind your head, and it seems to automatically
Get your breathing into your lower down into your belly.
Yeah, and I thought that was fascinating that just a few simple movements could sort of unlock.
When you say the book, you mean Leon Chatow's Recognizing and Treating Breathing Disorders, don't you?
That's the one.
Yeah. That's that beach pose is one that's used by physios, physiotherapists. It's a great position. It's nice because you're immobilizing the shoulders and chest, and it's helping you use the lower rib cage
Yeah.
to breathe and the belly to breathe. But the thing about that is just that when pushing the belly in and out isn't necessarily breathing with your diaphragm.
Yeah.
You know that,
Yeah,
don't
yeah,
you?
yeah.
Yeah. Because your diaphragm, it attaches to the lower 6 ribs, and if you keep your belly firm, if you've got movement at the ribs, the sides and the back, that's still diaphragm breathing. Like, it doesn't have to be your belly going in and out.
Yeah, yeah.
And also people with asthma, actually asthma, that's a really good example. So you get someone with asthma and they've learnt to breathe against resistance, okay, the resistance of airway obstruction. And they're more sensitive to the rise of CO2 and also the feeling of airway resistance. And so they can overexpress, an active configuration of breathing. Like, that's kind of the way I'd think about it.
Right.
So it's like, oh, okay, you're overexpressing the active configuration of breathing. And the Buteyko method was most well known for helping asthma. I was very, very successful for that.
Yep.
And I always wondered why, like Buteyko always felt that it was hyperventilation. And he actually had this story where he said asthma wasn't a disease, it was just a defense mechanism against hyperventilation.
Yep.
Which clearly is not the case. Can't be, because there are so many different types of asthma and there's a genetic component and, not every asthmatic is hyperventilating as well.
Yeah, definitely.
And so on. So, but it's really interesting because original Buteyko method, as taught by Buteyko when I was there in the 90s and how he wrote about it, because we translated his works from Russian to English, and he says, okay, so the whole of my method is reduce your breathing by relaxing the muscles of respiration until you feel a light lack of air. So his whole breathing is actually breathing at lower volumes. And that's really interesting because a lot of people who have had something like asthma or an obstructive lung disease, they get greedy for breathing in and they don't breathe out much. And so they get hyperinflated. And I really think that Buteyko didn't just work through hyperventilation. I think that it worked through reducing hyperinflation as well. Plus, in the Buteyko method, particularly as it was taught originally, the way we all learnt it back in the early 90s, it was all about welcoming the lack of air, enjoying the feeling of being slightly breathless, and learning, putting a different cognitive frame around that so that suddenly it's like, oh no, this is good. Feeling a lack of air is good because it's actually CO2, which is a bronchodilator and it's giving me more oxygen and it's making everything better. So people all of a sudden kind of like something changes in their brain about how they're approaching breathlessness.
Yep.
So it's like, because I was very interested in the Buteyko method because it was one of the things I worked with so intensively for 10 years. And then it was like, oh, wait a minute, the Buteyko method even is working on 3 dimensions. It's working on the biochemical, the biomechanical, and the psychophysiological, because it's helping hyperinflation, it's helping hyperventilation, and it's also working with that, the fear of not being able to get air, even unconscious fears of not being able to get enough air, which makes it a really interesting technique. But it does mean if you're working in an individualised way, if you're doing a proper full assessment, you can really get what the main thing is for a person, and then you can really direct, your treatment to them. And it's interesting because I was working with someone just yesterday, who had asthma as a child, had it really under control, and then as an adult it came on with a vengeance.
Right.
Really badly. He was hospitalised and for long periods and repeatedly, and he started working with the Buteyko method and quite a strict form because there are different varieties, different people doing different things. It's kind of changed over the years. But he was working with a a stricter variety of reducing the volume, breathing less, breathing less, breathing less.
Yep.
And working on extending his breath holds. And just really wasn't improving at all. And then he's in hospital, and then he realised, wait a minute, what would happen if I stretched out my lungs and breathed more? And he did that, and within 2 hours he was out of hospital.
Interesting.
Because he actually needed something else, do you know?
Yeah.
And so then he said, oh, okay, I want to work with you and just sort of tweak this. So we went, okay, well, let's work with the active configuration. He'd been so inhibiting his own breathing.
Right.
But for him, that was not the balance. He needed to have a bit of the other stuff.
Yeah.
So, and I certainly don't have all the answers. I'm learning all the time from patients and from research and other people's research. And, I learned so much just from measuring, seeing if things improve. If they don't improve, ask why,
Yeah.
Try and problem solve.
Yeah.
And think it through from first principles, using as sound information as I can get, based on the scientific literature.
Yeah.
Because for me, it's not about the therapy. It's about the patient. It's about the person and their problem and their suffering and what needs to be done, for them. So.
Yeah. Mark of a great practitioner.
Well, trying to do a reasonable job, but yeah.
Well, it sounds like you're taking the most nuanced approach that I've heard, and I'm incredibly grateful that you've given me some of your time. I've learnt quite a lot, and even reading quite a bit about this. This has been really enlightening for me as well. So
great.
I can't wait to share this, and hopefully we can keep in touch. And I can continue to learn from you, because I think there's a lot that we can, because everyone's different. There's a lot we can learn about how to treat everyone on their level.
Yeah, because what I'd really like to see, I think that everyone should have a daily breathing practice. And if you're reasonably healthy, just a simple breathing practice that makes you feel good is fantastic, because you're really helping your mind, your nervous system, and you're helping your breathing to regulate other body systems. So really in favour of that. But in people who are really having breathing difficulties, I'm really sort of hoping, with the rest of my working life to kind of get a greater recognition of, a sort of comprehensive, nuanced and individualised approach to breathing retraining for those people.
Yep.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, thank you.
We will keep in touch.
Okay.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. I really hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to keep up with Rosalba's work, I've put some links to her platforms in the episode notes and a link to the book that we referenced during the podcast as well. If you'd like to support the podcast, you can subscribe on Spotify and YouTube, and you can leave up to a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. This is a simple, no-cost way to support my work and help me reach more listeners. Please feel free to leave comments on my YouTube channel, as I do try to read through as many as I can. I've also put links to all of my social media platforms in the episode notes if you'd like updates about the podcast, information about health, or you'd just like to reach out to me. Thanks again for listening, everyone. Take care.